Hi folks, Tim here, and welcome back to From 8 to 38, the Chronicles of a Young Entrepreneur, Humble Beginnings. And what we're going to be doing is reminiscing a little bit and talking about some of the people that I worked for early on in my career as a landscaper. And I jokingly say that as a career because I was only 8 or 9 years old. So let's go all the way to the beginning. Now, I was 8 years old, playing, no doubt, in my parents' yard, doing whatever it is that 8-year-old boys did, whether it be riding a bike or running through the woods, playing with sticks, who knows what I was doing. But during this summer, our neighbor from the middle lot came over to my parents' house and asked my mother if I would be willing to come over and work for him, weeding the garden and trimming the tomatoes a little bit and just things like that. So simple gardening tasks is where I started at 8 years old. Now my mother, of course, said, absolutely, Tim would be very happy to come do that for you. So I did that. And I worked for Fred, that's what we're gonna call him. I worked for Fred for several years. Now, Fred was an interesting gentleman. He was an old Italian man who, in his later years, walked with a cane. But come to find out, he was a tanker during World War II. And he was in many of the large battles, but I don't remember what his job was as far as in the tank, but he was in the tanks during World War II. So Fred had a lot of very interesting stories as far as that goes. I know for a fact he was in the Battle of the Bulge. I'm not sure what other battles, but I do remember that one. Anyway, so Fred would have me weed the tomatoes, prune the suckers off, pick rocks out of the garden, just help him do tasks that him and his older wife couldn't do. So that was the first person I worked for early on. Now, a couple years later, Fred got a hold of my mother again and said, hey, would it be okay if Tim started push mowing our lawn? Well, I had only ever done that at my parents' house. So this was a new venture for me, but she said, sure, Tim can do that for you. And I started push mowing his yard. Well, I used to ride my bike all over the neighborhood. We lived in a nice little dead-end type neighborhood. Everybody had 2, 3, 4, somewhere in there as far as the acreage. So it wasn't, it was residential, but it was very rural, and it wasn't a city type of neighborhood. So it was a good place to go around, pick up sticks, pine cones, leaves, weed gardens, things like that. So I was riding my bike one Saturday, and I was riding back and forth, and a neighbor a couple houses up the road from my parents was out raking his yard, and he was picking up pine cones in particular. Now, if you're from our area, or if you've dealt with pine trees at all, you know what pine cones are like. Not the most fun job to pick up, especially as you get a little older. Not nice in your back, your legs. You get pine sap all over, so just not the most fun job. But Harold, and that's what we're gonna call him, Harold was out working in his yard, picking up pine cones. So I rode by and I saw him, and then the next week he was out doing the same thing. So I said, you know what, I'm gonna stop and see if he needs help with any yard work. At this point, I believe I was 11 years old. So I've been working for Fred for a couple of years, weeding the garden, mowing the lawn, pruning some things for him, shoveling the driveway, shoveling paths, just a lot of different projects that he could no longer handle since he was, I believe, in his 80s. So went on to Harold and said, you know, I can help do what you need done around the yard. I don't really care what it is. I want to work. Well, I think that was something different than he was used to encountering. So he said, okay, Tim, you know what? I've got all these pine cones and sticks all over this yard. We're trying to get it cleaned up, and I just really don't want to do it. So I will pay you to come through and pick up all of these pine cones and sticks. I said, all right, I'll do that for you. Well, the next week I went to work, and I got to work and I brought the rake over and a tarp and a wheelbarrow, and I just wheeled it up the road, a couple houses up the road, and cleaned everything up. And I don't remember how many hours it took, but at 11 years old, that was a decent amount of work. It kept me fairly busy, especially after school. But the next week, Harold came back and he looked around and he was really, really impressed with the work that I had done at that age, especially. And he said, well, you've certainly proved yourself. I would like to have you do more. There are many other projects that he had other people on the property for, but I was able to weed for him, and I took over the mulching the next year. So at 12 years old, I was able to find somebody who would actually deliver to me. Now, of course, I had to do it through my parents because they took a check, and there's no 12-year-old that has a checking account. Did the mulch for him. He was very happy with the mulch, and we continued to do the leaves and the pine cones and sticks and things like that. Well, about a year later, Harold came to me and said, Tim, would you be interested in taking over the lawn? And I said, you know, I would be, but what I would really like to do is be able to sign a seasonal contract with you. And that kind of perked his interest. I said, you know, I would like to do the lawn, and I will do that from April 15th to October 30th or somewhere in that range. And I will do the leaves, and I will pick up the sticks and the pine cones, and we will keep the garden beds weeded. And once a week I will come over and empty the pool strainer. So even though you have a company that does it, I'll come over and empty the pool strainer. The pool guy usually was Thursday, so I'd do it Tuesday, and then he would do it when he was home on Saturday. And he also had a small shed where the pool equipment was, right? Most people have that. A small shed type structure where all the pool equipment is. And he was always having a problem with mice in there. And I said, you know, I'll come in on Wednesday, Tuesday or Wednesday, and I'll check the mouse traps and refresh them if need be. So at about 13 years old, I'm quite sure it was at 13 years old, I had my first signed contract with someone. And it was somewhere in the area of $3,000 a year. Now that was for the lawn mowing, the weeding, the weed whacking, the leaf blowing, all the maintenance, the pool, the mouse traps, and it included during the winter going in once a week and just making sure everything in the house looked good, bringing the mail in, setting it on the kitchen table, things like that. So that was my experience with Harold, and that relationship went on for quite a few years, and it went well. There was another guy in the neighborhood. His name was Jim. Now, Jim and his wife owned one of the larger properties in my parents' neighborhood, and he had landscaped most of it, but even to the point where the woods were raked out and cleaned up. So this was the first big job that I had ever really worked on. Was he wanted me to start with the leaf cleanup. Now, the leaf cleanup on that property was a lot of work. It was substantial, especially the sticks and the leaves actually in the woods. You had enormous oak trees and maple trees, and those trees, they drop a lot of leaves and a lot of sticks. So that was my first job with him. He was very happy with it. He had a lot of garden beds as well, landscaped areas around the house. So we had to come in and hand pick all the leaves out of those bushes. And I remember not loving working on that property. He would often call me back and have me come back to pick up leaves that we missed, things like that. But it was a really, really good learning experience. Even though it wasn't my favorite place to work, it was a good learning experience, and it helped mold me into what I am today. It helped with the detail-oriented part of the landscape work that we do. So all these things were very important. Now, Jim went on to hire me to mow the lawn. shovel the driveway, and he was one of the ones that agreed to allow me to take over the lawn mowing when I bought my tractor. So if you watched our video from 2 weeks ago, you'll see me sitting on my tractor, and that's the tractor I worked hard to make the money to buy, and Jim agreed to allow me to mow the lawn for him because he realized that I would do a good job. I told him that we would be diligent and meticulous and we'd do a good job, and we certainly did. We did a better job than the company, the professional landscape company that was doing it. And at that time I was only, I guess, 13 or 14 years old. So those were the first three that I worked for, Fred, Harold, and Jim. Now, there was a fourth guy that I started working for, and his name was Dan, and that was all the way at the end of the road. It was, I think, close to half a mile away, and my parents would drop me off there, or I would ride my bike down. And the first job he gave me was picking up all the sticks in the woods. Now, everybody around us had woods, and there were always sticks coming down, so he wanted me to go through and pick up all the sticks in the woods. And at the time, he offered to pay me $1 an hour more than my other clients were. So I don't remember if that meant a jump from $4.50 to $5.50 or from $5 to $6 an hour, whatever the case may be. But it was a very interesting time for me because I had the opportunity to make $1 an hour more, which was very significant, especially at 13 years old. So I learned how to deal with that. I had a conversation with some of my other clients that, hey, there's this other person that wants to pay me more an hour. Would you be willing to match it? And some were and some weren't. And the ones that were not willing to match it, I had an honest conversation with them and said, well, if this individual is willing to pay me $6 and you are only willing to pay me $5, then he's going to get the time before you are. And some were okay with that and some weren't, but that was my first real experience as far as running the business and dealing with client relations. So that's an important one. Now as our business has progressed over the last 25 years from that point, but over the last 30 years, I've learned how to do that better, how to manage those type of things better. Our clients that have been with us for so many years, we do take care of them, and they may have a different pricing on a job than a new client that just comes through the door. But I explain to everyone that these folks have been with us for 20 years or 25 years. They are people who earned that right to pay a little bit less after so many years of loyalty. So that was something that I learned early on, and it's something that we've carried through to this very day. But those were the first couple people that I worked for, and I'm going to include a couple little pictures here. This first one is an image that I was able to find going back through old pictures, and this is the first thing that I put in people's mailboxes in the neighborhood when I was trying to get more work, and it is this little Tim's Business picture. You can see me with a smiling face and enormous ears, and I showed this to one of my clients the other day and they got the biggest kick out of it, so I decided that we should include that in this video because I guess it's just too funny not to share. But that was my first intro into marketing, so including that picture just because it's funny. Anyway, that's a brief summary of the first 4 people that I worked for and some of my experiences with them, how I started. And again, this is humble beginnings is what we've labeled this chapter, from 8 to 38, humble beginnings. And it's true, we started, or I keep saying we because the business is more than just me at this point, but I started this business small in the neighborhood I grew up in, knocking on doors. And that is a way that you as a young entrepreneur can be successful. You can start a small business in your neighborhood and knock on doors and be successful at it. So just wanted to end on that note. Thank you for watching From 8 to 38, The Chronicles of a Young Entrepreneur, Chapter 5, Humble Beginnings. And be on the lookout for our next video. Again, we release these every Monday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. And if you have any questions or comments or concerns, please comment below. And our email address is elmendorfacres@gmail.com. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.